Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, where the past isn't just dusty dates and broken ruins. It's bone-chilling wind, flickering firelight, and the kind of cold that claws through your clothes like it's alive. Tonight, we're not just talking about castles, we're sleeping in one, and trust me, you're going to wish you weren't. You've seen them in travel brochures, perched high on hills, looming above sleepy valleys, stone fortresses wrapped in mist like something out of a fairy tale. Medieval castles look majestic, romantic even, especially when the sun's hitting the turrets just right. But now imagine standing at the entrance of one not at noon, but at midnight. The sun is long gone, the torches barely flicker, and the wind screams through the arrow slits like a banshee that knows your name. Suddenly, those Instagram reels seem a lot less magical. Now step inside. Thick walls rise around you, 30 feet tall in places and made of cold, unyielding stone. The floor beneath your boots is uneven, slick in patches with melted snow tracked in by servants or soldiers. Every breath you take clouds the air before you. Yes, inside. There is no insulation. There is no central heating. You've just entered a medieval castle in the dead of winter, and you are very much on your own. The architecture itself was built for defense, not comfort. Those heavy stones hold no warmth. In fact, they do the opposite. They drink it. Heat vanishes into them like water into sand, leaving only dampness and chill. Windows, if you can call them that, are tiny slits meant for arrows, not sunlight. Even the grandest halls feel like cathedrals to frost, echoing with every footstep, whispering drafts down your spine. You're not just cold, you feel hunted by it. Let's pause for a moment. You're probably thinking, okay, but surely the fire keeps things warm. Oh, sweet summer child. You see that grand fireplace across the great hall? It looks impressive, sure wide enough to roast a boar, big enough to walk into. But here's the medieval secret. Those fireplaces were liars. They were inefficient, drafty, and as heat rose into the chimney, precious little stayed behind. The closer you stood, the warmer you felt. But take 5 steps away, and it was as if the fire never existed. Most of the hall fell back into bitter silence an hour after sunset. But the misery didn't stop at architecture. It shaped daily life in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. In today's world, cold means adjusting the thermostat or throwing on a sweater. In the Middle Ages, it meant survival mode. Entire families, noble or common, had to plan their evenings like a military campaign. The goal? Trap any trace of warmth before it escaped into the stone void. Imagine this. Servants hurrying through corridors with thick tapestries, nailing them over cracks in the walls or hanging them like blankets around beds. The wealthiest moved wall hangings from one estate to another, not for decoration, but for insulation. Some even had oak panelling nailed to bedroom walls just to stop the wind from slicing through the mortar. Every detail, from bed placement to fabric choice, became a tool in the fight against the night. And don't even think about sleeping early. Households didn't just go to bed, they retreated to it. Firewood was banked strategically to make it last. Every cloak, every fur, every spare pelt was dragged into service. People wore layers over layers until movement became optional. Heavy gowns, woolen hose, thick caps, even gloves were kept on in bed. Sleepwear wasn't lacy or elegant. It was utilitarian, scratchy, and shaped more by fear than fashion. Even the bed itself wasn't what you'd imagine. Sure, if you were noble, you might have a raised wooden frame and something resembling a mattress. But more often, you were lying on straw or coarse wool stuffed into sagging fabric. Blankets were heavy, yes, but not always warm. The moment your body stopped moving, the cold crept in like smoke under a door. And that's assuming you even had your own space. In smaller castles, families often shared beds. Children slept at their parents' feet. Servants dozed on rush-covered floors or cramped pallets against the wall. Warmth, not privacy, was the currency of the night. Then there were the psychological games the cold played. Chroniclers from the era wrote about dreading the winter chill more than hunger or even disease. At least illness might pass. The cold? It returned every single night, like a ghost you couldn't banish. People genuinely feared freezing to death while they slept, and not without reason. Tales of travellers found stiff with ice in their lungs, nobles dying in their beds from nothing more than a poorly banked fire. These weren't cautionary myths. They were real. So why didn't they simply move to smaller, warmer homes? Good question. In truth, some did. Castles often had seasonal rooms, low ceilings, smaller fireplaces, and less space to lose heat. But not every castle was designed with that luxury. Many had no such features, forcing inhabitants to adapt or suffer. And yet, there was a strange kind of beauty in this brutal ritual. Every element of the evening, banking the fire, arranging the bed curtains, drinking mulled wine, wrapping toes in linen, became a gesture of defiance, not against an enemy or invader, but against the cold itself. Sleep wasn't a surrender, it was a negotiation, a quiet, nightly truce with a world built from stone and ice. So next time you visit a castle and marvel at its grandeur, remember this. The people who lived there weren't romantic heroes lounging in comfort. They were survivors. Every night they fought battles you can't see in the stonework. Not with swords, but with wool, fire, and sheer willpower. And you wouldn't last an hour. You wouldn't last an hour, and neither would your expectations of comfort. Because, as that fleeting warmth slipped from the great hall into memory, people turned reluctantly toward the night's real challenge, surviving the long, creeping cold that settled like fog over every stone surface. Walking away from the hearth meant walking into a different reality, one where silence replaced song, and frost waited behind every corridor. The stairs, often spiraling and uneven, led to chambers that felt less like bedrooms and more like tombs. Narrow and unheated, the walls inside these rooms sweated in the cold. Air hung still and damp, clinging to garments, seeping into bones. Even the act of disrobing, peeling off travel cloaks or heavy boots became a miniature ordeal. And so, many chose not to. Clothes weren't changed, they were layered. Outerwear became nightwear, and comfort was sacrificed for the illusion of survival. To call this sleep is generous. It was closer to hibernation mixed with strategy. Beds were positioned away from walls to dodge the worst drafts. Thick tapestries, sometimes soaked in wax or oil, were hung like curtains around the frame. This wasn't decoration, it was insulation, a desperate attempt to trap any warmth the body could offer. The canopy wasn't a royal indulgence, it was an essential structure to create an artificial ceiling of warmth. Think of it as a tent within a frozen fortress. Within those draped enclosures, the air might rise just a few degrees above the ambient cold. Enough to matter, never enough to forget. And if you think heavy blankets were a luxury, remember this. Linen in excess was once thought dangerous. Some believed it drew heat from the body, so people layered carefully, often combining furs, rough wool, and even hay-stuffed sacks. Anything to stave off the bone-deep chill that threatened every extremity. The worst hit first. Toes and fingers, ears and noses. These were battlegrounds. Manuscripts from the period even advised sleepers to bind their feet in wool or linen, not for comfort, but to avoid frostbite. Bed warmers, those copper pans filled with coals and slid between sheets, weren't luxury items. They were medical tools in an age before central heat. And still, they came with risk. The embers could spark fire, the heat could scald. But what was a blister when weighed against a night of shivering? And the silence? It wasn't comforting. It was cavernous. Wind moaned through arrow slits. The settling of old wood echoed like distant footsteps. Castles weren't quiet. They were filled with uncanny sounds that blurred the line between structure and presence. Every creak became a question. Is it the stone shifting, or something else? The psychological toll ran deeper than the physical. Chroniclers from Burgundy to York recorded the dread of nighttime chill as more profound than the fear of illness or starvation. Hunger came in waves. Sickness could be diagnosed and sometimes cured, but cold was permanent. Night after night, season after season. And unlike plague or warfare, there was no one to blame. Only the architecture, the climate, and the limits of the body. This fear of the cold manifested in strange beliefs. Some nobles refused to travel without their own bedding, even in summer. Others kept sleeping chambers near kitchens, where warmth from the hearth rose through floorboards. One documented case describes an elderly matron who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse during winter, declaring that the heat of the ovens kept her alive. Eccentric, perhaps, but she likely outlived others because of it. There was no part of sleep untouched by ritual. A servant might spend an hour preparing a noble's bed, sweeping out ashes from the warming pan, stuffing gaps with moss, placing hot stones at the foot of the mattress. Every step was purposeful, because if even one task was missed, if a fire wasn't properly banked or a curtain left cracked, the sleeper could wake up shaking or not wake at all. And all this effort, it still didn't guarantee peace. People awoke frequently, some from discomfort, others by design. Fires had to be watched, stoked at intervals. Animals stirred, and so did their human companions. Sleep was segmented, fractured by survival. Monks rose to pray. Guards rotated on shifts. Peasants turned in their sleep, listening for signs of sickness in their children. The medieval night was never still. It was simply darker. Even in shared chambers, warmth was fragile. Nobles might bed with their dogs or trusted companions. Maids were kept nearby not just for service, but for proximity. Heat, not intimacy, dictated the sleeping arrangements. And among the lower classes, bodies piled close by necessity. Entire families and livestock shared the same single-room cottage. The stench was overwhelming, but so was the alternative, isolation and exposure. This contrast between noble chill and peasant closeness led to fascinating debates among historians. Who fared better, the wealthy with layers of fur and fabric, or the poor, whose compact homes and tight quarters offered natural insulation? There is no clear answer, but the fact that the question exists at all speaks to how deeply sleep mirrored status, and how no one, regardless of wealth, could escape the cold entirely. Even the sense of smell betrayed survival. Enter any chamber and the first scent was smoke, not of warmth but of suffocation. Fireplaces were inefficient and soot drifted freely. Walls blackened. Lungs did too. Some believed this smoke helped preserve wooden beams, deterring pests. Others saw it as a necessary evil, and no matter how often servants swept or herbs were hung to sweeten the air, the smell never left. It became part of the architecture, part of the people. And you, standing there in imagination, what do you notice first? Not just the cold, but the layers of effort behind each breath, the preparation, the fear, the ritual. You haven't even made it to bed yet, and already you're shivering. This isn't discomfort, it's discipline, a nightly act of resistance. And you begin to understand why every flicker of fire, every rustle of fur, every sip of warm wine became sacred, because they weren't luxuries. They were the only defences left in a world that refused to forgive. You begin to understand why fire wasn't a comfort. It was a necessity, a ritual, and sometimes a deception. For all the admiration we hold for grand stone hearths and roaring medieval fires, the truth is they rarely delivered what they promised. Even the largest fireplaces, gaping wide as a cave, devoured fuel at astonishing rates and returned very little warmth to the room itself. The heat they generated rose straight into the yawning chimney above, sucked away by the very architecture designed to protect the people inside. What was left behind was light and smoke and the illusion of safety. Fire, as people knew it then, was more symbolic than practical. It marked a centre of family, of attention, of hope, but it was rarely efficient. The design of chimneys, still primitive by today's standards, left entire chambers partially heated at best. A chair placed too far from the blaze would offer nothing but shivers. Cold air constantly spilled back through cracks in mortar and unsealed gaps in walls, undoing whatever fragile microclimate had been achieved by the blaze. The closer you sat to the flames, the more alive you felt. Step back, and you were right back in winter's grip. And yet, people clung to these hearths not just for physical heat, but for the glow they cast on faces, for the way stories sounded better beside embers, and for the psychological shield they provided against the void just outside. A medieval night was long and absolute. Darkness poured in through every crack, swallowing corridors, chambers, courtyards. The fire was the only thing that pushed back. Its crackle was comfort. Its flicker was movement in a world that otherwise stood still. It's easy to forget that for many, the fire wasn't just a place to warm hands, it was a full ecosystem. Meals were cooked there, clothes were dried, wounds were treated, and prayers were whispered. People believed in the curative power of fire, not just its physical effects. A warmed stone placed near the belly could settle sickness. Smoke might preserve wood or ward off evil spirits. Some households kept coals alive year-round, transferring embers from one log to another to avoid the spiritual discomfort of letting the hearth go cold. Letting it die wasn't just careless, it was almost shameful. But what made the fire most deceptive was the sense of permanence it gave. The glow lulled people into thinking the warmth would last. It never did. After the evening's gathering, after the minstrels quieted their instruments and the servants withdrew, the fire was no longer fed generously. Wood was precious, and wasteful burning was discouraged. Slowly, the flames would shrink, collapsing inward. Red embers pulsed quietly beneath the ash, a final stand against the night. Those who stayed too long beside the hearth often regretted it. They'd carry that fading heat with them up the stairs, only to feel it dissolve by the time they reached their beds. And what of those who had no fire at all? Not everyone had access to central hearths or thick logs. In poorer cottages, fires were smaller, more carefully rationed, and often served multiple purposes. People crouched close to the ground, where heat lingered a few seconds longer. Families gathered tightly, pressing knees to the stone floor, backs curved inward, trying to absorb every ounce of radiance before sleep pulled them apart again. Some even buried embers beneath ash to preserve them overnight, a method older than the castles themselves. The relationship between medieval people and fire was fragile. They knew its dangers intimately. Open flames danced beside straw beds, dry rushes, and heavy curtains, materials that burned fast and without mercy. There are accounts of entire wings lost to candle accidents, of noble linens scorched by careless embers, of children disfigured in sleep. Yet despite the risk, there was no alternative. Fire was risk management. You had to weigh the cost of freezing against the chance of flame, and most chose the former. Because freezing was slow, it began at the toes, crept up through the calves, locked joints in place until movement became painful. Your breath grew shallow, thoughts muddled. The fear wasn't that you'd feel too much, it was that you'd stop feeling anything at all. Better a fire that crackled with menace than a bed of frost that whispered you to sleep forever. That's why fires weren't simply built, they were orchestrated. Servants used bellows and fans to stir them awake. Wet logs were a death sentence, dry wood was currency. Some households even scented the flames, tossing herbs into the blaze to mask the pervasive smell of smoke and sweat. Juniper was popular, not just for its crisp fragrance, but for its supposed spiritual protection. Rosemary and sage followed closely, believed to purify the room and calm uneasy spirits. In this way, the hearth was not just the room's heart, it was its altar, and those who watched over it held power. In noble households, the firekeeper was often a trusted servant, someone who knew the difference between warming and waste. Their timing was impeccable. Too early, and the heat would vanish before sleep. Too late, and the coals wouldn't catch. In monasteries and castles, there were those whose sole duty was to rise in the darkest hours to stir the embers, ensuring the hearth never truly died. In some cultures, this role was assigned with ceremony. It was understood that the warmth of an entire hall depended on the discipline of one. Yet no matter how carefully it was tended, the fire always lost. By the time midnight pressed down over the land, the halls fell quiet, the red glow dimmed, and the air grew sharper. That final descent into cold was familiar to everyone who lived behind stone walls. It didn't matter how many layers you wore or how heavy the bed curtains were. Once the fire's light faded, so did the illusion of safety. You were alone again, with the dark, with the wind, and with the stone that refused to remember the heat. This loss became part of the nightly rhythm. People expected it. They carried the warmth with them as far as it would go, sometimes wrapping warmed bricks in cloth to keep at their feet, sometimes pressing pets to their legs for shared body heat. But nothing truly replaced the fire. When it was gone, everything else was a simulation. And so, night after night, medieval people rehearsed the same choreography. They built the fire, fed it, praised it, feared it, and mourned it. It was a brief, blazing god that gave everything, and then demanded you fend for yourself. When the fire died, so did the illusion that the castle was a place meant for human comfort. Whatever warmth had lingered was now just memory. The walls, once glowing with orange light, returned to their natural state, dark, damp, and uninviting. What remained was not heat, but the task of preparing for a night that would need to be endured more than enjoyed. And so began the next battle, making the bed into a shelter. It's easy to underestimate how complex this process was. We think of beds today as passive objects, a place to collapse, relax, dream. But in the medieval world, a bed was an active defense system. Its construction, materials, and placement were all chosen with strategic intent. A mattress wasn't just a cushion, it was a critical buffer between the human body and a floor that radiated chill from below. In wealthier households, the mattress might be stuffed with feathers, though this brought its own discomfort. Feathers shifted, collapsed inward, and retained moisture. Worse, they could trap heat so well that the sleeper would wake drenched in sweat, only to freeze moments later. More commonly, beds were packed with straw, coarse wool, or a mix of moss and hay. These materials offered insulation and could be replaced seasonally. But they also carried pests, lice, fleas, even mice. No matter how tightly the sheets were pulled, the boundaries between bedding and vermin were thin. People tried to combat this by mixing herbs into the stuffing. Lavender, mint, and tansy were all favoured not just for their scent, but for their supposed pest-repelling properties. Yet even the most fragrant mattress couldn't cancel out the cold. Then came the bedding layers, an arrangement as ceremonial as it was practical. The bottom sheet, often coarse linen, was stretched tight across the frame. Over this came blankets of increasing thickness, first wool, then perhaps fur, then a final quilted cover if one was available. But layering wasn't just about adding warmth, it was about creating zones. Each layer had a purpose. Some were wrapped around the sleeper, others tucked along the edges to seal in heat. The outermost often hung over the bed frame itself, like a tent, to trap whatever warmth the human body could produce. And above it all, the canopy. In some cases, this was built into the bed frame, a wooden structure with vertical posts and a roof draped in thick cloth. Curtains hung down each side and were drawn tightly shut at night. Inside this enclosure, the air grew slightly warmer, sometimes by just a few degrees. But in a castle, that could mean the difference between sleep and waking up shivering. It also meant total darkness. Once enclosed, the sleeper was sealed off from flickering torchlight and wandering eyes. Within that space, they created their own atmosphere, a private world in a building that rarely allowed for privacy. But the cold crept in anyway. No matter how heavy the quilts or how tightly the curtains were drawn, the ambient air pressed through cracks in the wall, across the floorboards, and around the canopy edge like an unwanted guest. That's where bed warmers came in. These were metal pans, typically copper, with a long handle. A servant would fill them with red-hot embers from the hearth and slide them back and forth between the sheets just before the occupant climbed in. It was a precarious task. If the embers were too hot, they could scorch the linen. If they were too weak, the bed remained icy. There are recorded instances of bedding catching fire, entire rooms filling with smoke, even cases of burns severe enough to scar. But without the warming pan, the alternative was worse. Lying down in an unheated bed meant an hour of shaking before body heat accumulated enough to dull the bite. For the elderly or the ill, this weight could be dangerous. Hypothermia didn't need snow, it needed time. Some households used heated stones instead, river rocks placed in the coals until they glowed, then wrapped in thick cloth and tucked near the feet. These retained heat longer and were less likely to ignite sheets. But even this solution came with trade-offs. The stone cooled slowly, which could create moisture, and damp bedding in a castle was nearly impossible to dry until the next day. Yet many preferred this method, accepting a little wetness over another hour of frostbitten limbs. What's perhaps most striking is how much of this effort was deeply ritualized. These weren't random acts. They were choreographed responses to centuries of shared hardship. Servants had routines, sequences memorized through long repetition. Children grew up watching their parents prepare beds like altars. Every gesture, tucking, layering, heating, was passed down as inheritance. These acts weren't viewed as optional. They were survival. And still, the cold found a way in. It slicked under doors, between roof beams, through the glassless windows covered only by oiled cloth or horn panels. These makeshift coverings dulled the wind, but they didn't silence it. It howled through courtyards, bled through the smallest fractures in mortar. People began to internalize the idea that no matter how well you prepared, you were never really safe. Not from the cold, not in a castle. This fear even seeped into language. Medical texts from the time warned of humours congealing in the body due to night chills. Physicians advised rubbing warm oil into the soles of feet before bed, drinking heated milk, or placing a clove of garlic under the pillow. The cold wasn't just discomfort. It was believed to cause disease. Entire diagnoses were built around the idea that too much cold at night could turn your blood sluggish, your stomach weak, your lungs wet. Warmth, in contrast, was life, and so people sought it in every way they could. Some even invited their dogs into bed, not as pets, but as living radiators. The presence of a hound pressed against the legs might be the only thing preventing numbness. In the lower classes, farm animals were often kept inside for this very reason. Sheep and goats shared floor space, sometimes even straw piles, with their owners. The smell was thick, but the warmth was real. And in a world that offered so little control, that kind of certainty mattered. Still, there were nights when even that wasn't enough. Nights when the embers died early, the stone grew colder than usual, the wind blew harder. On those nights, people didn't sleep so much as endure. They lay still, muscles tensed, waiting for the first hint of dawn. The ritual hadn't failed, it had simply reached its limits. And beyond that edge was something few wanted to face. There were nights when even ritual and preparation failed, when every layer of wool and every ember in the pan felt like a losing gamble against the endless cold. It was in these moments that the medieval bed, once viewed as a refuge, revealed itself as a fortress under siege. Each beam, curtain, blanket and mattress wasn't about luxury. It was part of a nightly campaign to survive the hours between sunset and dawn. The construction of a bed in a medieval castle tells you more about the reality of the era than any banquet hall or throne room. These were not simply places to sleep. They were engineered spaces, often bespoke to the room and the rank of the sleeper, meant to fight a specific enemy, exposure. The materials varied based on wealth, but the goals remained the same. Trap heat, repel drafts, and create a microclimate in a stone box that refused to yield to the seasons. Let's start from the bottom. A common base was a wooden platform or rope lattice stretched tightly to provide some lift from the freezing floor. The floor itself, often made of bare stone or packed earth, acted as a natural conductor of cold. In noble rooms, it might be covered with woven mats, wooden boards, or layers of rushes, but these did little more than soften the psychological blow. Heat still escaped downward. Raising the sleeper just a foot above ground was not comfort. It was thermal strategy. The mattress was the next layer of defense, and its contents determined whether the night would pass with relative ease or restless torment. Straw was abundant and cheap, but it broke down quickly, attracted bugs, and grew damp in humid weather. Wool offered better insulation and fewer pests, but was heavy, itchy, and held odours like a sponge. The wealthiest slept on feather beds, but even these had problems. Feathers shifted constantly, creating lumpy terrain, and retained body heat to the point of suffocation. In summer, they became oppressive. In winter, they could trap just enough warmth to make getting out of bed unbearable. Above the mattress, layers of bedding were applied like armour. The first might be a sheet linen if available, hemp if not, coarse and often unwashed. Hygiene was less important than preservation. Next came the blankets, woolen, stitched, sometimes lined with fur, and weighted for maximum insulation. Over that, a quilt or counterpane, often patched and handed down through generations. Each layer served a thermal role, and the order in which they were arranged was a carefully learned routine. But none of it mattered if the air inside the bed wasn't contained. That's where bed curtains came in. The medieval four-poster bed wasn't a stylistic flourish. It was a climate control device. Thick drapes hung from carved frames or suspended canopies, drawn tight every night to seal in whatever heat the sleeper's body could generate. The result was a self-contained cocoon, a few degrees warmer than the rest of the room, and marginally protected from the howling draft outside. Inside this enclosure, everything was still. The fabric muffled sound. The flicker of torches beyond the curtain was reduced to shadows. The air, stale and often tinged with smoke or the faint scent of herbs, began to take on its own climate. Sometimes it became too warm, too humid. Sweat gathered on backs and brows. Blankets were kicked away, then regretted seconds later as cold air swept back in like punishment. Sleep became a dance between heat and chill, each movement disrupting the fragile balance of comfort. Nightwear played its role too. Contrary to popular imagery, people didn't sleep nude, not in winter. They wore layers to bed, long woolen shirts, stockings, caps, and sometimes gloves. Wealthier individuals had dedicated sleeping garments, occasionally trimmed in fur or embroidered at the cuffs, but even the finest nightgown was designed for function first. Wrapping oneself tightly was instinctual, like bracing for an invisible assault. Sleep was not relaxation, it was shelter. Yet no matter how well constructed the bed or how meticulously arranged the blankets, few slept undisturbed. Cold had a way of waking the body. Limbs cramped, toes ached. Breath came out in visible puffs, each one a silent reminder of how little insulation lay between the lungs and the frozen world outside. Some rose multiple times during the night, if only to adjust bedding, reposition a warming stone, or press closer to a co-sleeper. Shared sleeping wasn't only for the poor. Even among the nobility, bed-sharing occurred, between spouses, between parents and children, even between masters and favoured servants. It wasn't necessarily intimate. It was tactical. 2 bodies meant twice the heat. In extreme weather, dogs were invited in, pressed to legs and feet like furry heating pads. They carried dirt and fleas and occasionally chewed on bones beneath the blankets. But they were warm. That was enough. Lower classes relied on similar tactics, often in more cramped quarters. Entire families slept in a single room, with bodies curled against one another like bricks in a kiln. Farm animals were brought indoors, not for companionship, but for climate control. The warmth of a goat could stave off frostbite. The smell was unbearable to outsiders, but for those who lived it daily, it was simply the smell of surviving. For all the discomfort, the bed was a place of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. You couldn't command the wind or banish the draft from the wall, but you could layer your bedding, reposition your stones, and tuck your feet just right under the dog. People didn't expect comfort, they expected hardship. Their satisfaction came from how well they managed it. The morning was another trial. Rising meant leaving behind every ounce of warmth you had cultivated. The air outside the curtain hit like a slap. Some sat up slowly, wrapping cloaks around themselves before daring to draw the fabric aside. Others waited for servants to relight the fire, if such luxury was available. In poorer homes, there was no choice but to move quickly, to feed animals, stoke hearths, and begin the process of warming the home all over again. Each morning felt like a reset. The work of the previous night was erased by the stone's unrelenting nature. The fire had died, the bed had cooled, the air was sharp once more. Yet people rose anyway, drew back their bed curtains, placed their feet on cold floors, and stepped into the same rhythm that had kept them alive through winters past. They stepped into the rhythm not because it brought them comfort, but because it was what they knew, habits sculpted by necessity, passed down like inheritance. Yet even in something as basic as sleep, class dictated experience. A noble's cold was lined with fur and embroidered linen, while a peasant's cold pressed in through the roof, the floor, and the joints of the single-room hut they shared with goats and children. And while both suffered, they did not suffer equally. For the elite, sleep was woven with symbols. Embroidered nightgowns, sleeping hoods with decorative ribbons, fur-lined blankets stitched with family crests. These weren't just indulgences. They were displays of identity, even in darkness. A noble woman might have her feet wrapped in perfumed cloth, not just to keep them warm, but to mask the smell of damp stone and old wool. A nobleman might insist on fresh linens each week, even if they were just as cold as the stone beneath. In these actions, warmth was imagined, borrowed from status when nature denied it. But for all the embellishment, even castle life could be stripped bare by winter. And perhaps nowhere was that more visible than in the awkward intimacy of shared beds. Among the upper classes, etiquette dictated everything, even how one slept. Manuals from the period offer insight into where people were placed in a bed, depending on their status and relationship to the host. Lords might share a bed with their steward or page, not out of affection but out of trust, practicality, and heat conservation. Travellers could be invited to share bedding, not as guests in separate quarters, but side by side under the same cover. And among noble women, the presence of a maidservant sleeping close was considered proper, a practical safeguard against both the cold and, occasionally, the master of the house. Yet this closeness, born from survival, existed in tension with the era's obsession with hierarchy and virtue. A servant might be close enough to feel a noble's breath but never raise their voice or shift without permission. And while stories of scandal occasionally emerged, of lords bedding maids, of nobles being found in compromising situations, most of the time, these arrangements were accepted as mundane, boring, and necessary. When the frost crept into your bones, dignity took a back seat to function. Among the lower classes, these boundaries dissolved almost completely. Sleep was communal, chaotic, and deeply physical. Children slept beside parents, grandparents beside grandchildren. There was no privacy, no silence, no order, only warmth. Farm animals shared the same room, sometimes even the same bedding space. Their body heat, their rhythmic breath, their musky warmth became part of the nightly ritual. And while visitors from the city might wrinkle their noses at the stink of a peasant's home, those who lived in them rarely noticed. Smell, like hardship, faded into the background. Herbs offered one line of defence. Bundles of rosemary, lavender or mint were hung from rafters or stuffed into bedding to freshen the air. These weren't just for fragrance. They were believed to ward off sickness, insects, and even evil spirits. For peasants who lacked clean linens or medical care, this belief was practical and deeply ingrained. Some even believed that certain herbs could warm the air around them. Whether true or not, the psychological comfort they offered was enough. Medical beliefs surrounding sleep and cold were everywhere. Physicians, those who served the wealthy, often warned that the night chill could damage the body's humours. Cold, they said, thickened the blood, slowed the digestion, and clogged the lungs. Remedies included drinking warm wine, rubbing the feet with oil before bed, or eating heavy stews just before lying down. Sleep wasn't just biological, it was medical. A poorly prepared bed could make you sick. A restless night could be blamed for a cough, a limp, even a shift in mood. Some beliefs bordered on the superstitious. There are accounts of people placing charms beneath their pillows or hanging iron implements above their beds to ward off spirits. A popular method in parts of northern Europe was to sleep with a sprig of juniper above the doorframe. Juniper was thought to purify the air and frighten away unseen things that preyed on vulnerable sleepers. In a world where death was common and often unexplained, the line between practical and magical blurred. But even for those who followed every rule, illness and death still crept in. The elderly were especially vulnerable. Their bodies produced less heat, their circulation poorer, their resistance weaker. In some homes, older family members were given the warmest spots, nearest the hearth beside the animals, or bundled in extra layers. In castles, they were sometimes moved to kitchens or pantries during winter, places where heat lingered longer. One noblewoman famously refused to sleep in her chamber from November to March, choosing instead the bakery floor where ovens glowed all night. Her letters described the smell of flour, the constant warmth, and the relief of not waking up numb. Children, too, faced risk. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Parents kept them close, wrapped in layers, tucked between adults and siblings. There are stories, quiet, heartbreaking stories of babies who didn't stir come morning, their breath lost to a night just slightly colder than the last. And while families mourned, there was little shock. It was the price of winter, one that everyone paid eventually. Despite this, there was no sense of panic. The cold was accepted like a season, like the setting sun, inevitable, challenging, but not new. People adjusted, they layered, they adapted, and when they could, they improved. Over time, castles were modified. Tapestries became thicker. Chambers were walled off into smaller, more heat-efficient spaces. Wealthy estates designed entire wings just for winter living, compact and low-ceilinged with deep fireplaces. In cities, homes were built around central hearths with narrow, winding staircases that trapped warm air. Still, none of it eliminated the struggle, they only dulled it. And so the bed, that supposed symbol of rest, remained a battlefield. Each night demanded a fresh campaign. You folded the bedding just so. You arranged the curtains to block the draught you knew was coming. You placed the dog near your feet, the warming stone near your belly. You drank the spiced wine slowly, savouring every mouthful, because it might be the last warm thing your body felt before morning. And then you waited. You waited for sleep to come, for your body to generate just enough heat to push back the cold. You waited for the fire's last whisper to fade from memory. You waited for morning, not because you expected rest, but because you hoped to see it. You hoped to see it? The morning and every gesture before sleep was shaped by that quiet hope. The rituals weren't arbitrary. They were patterns forged in fear, refined by repetition, and passed from hand to hand like heirlooms. In a world where the dark held more than just shadows, these nightly customs formed the last fragile line between comfort and catastrophe. Everything had a purpose. Everything was time. The closing of the shutters, if there were any, came first, though most windows were simply holes stuffed with oiled linen or thin horn to keep out the worst of the wind. Even these fluttered and clattered through the night, but it was better than bare openings. Curtains were drawn early, firewood was rationed. If the evening had been generous, if the hearth still glowed, a few precious coals might be transferred to a smaller brazier to warm a private chamber. That moment, when the first glow met cold iron, often signalled the beginning of the descent into sleep. Clothes were not removed all at once. In fact, much of what you wore during the day stayed on. Outer layers came off, yes, but the base tunic, stockings, caps, and sometimes even gloves remained. Removing too much risked a shock of cold so sharp it could knock the wind from your lungs. Instead, people undressed in stages, performing each motion like a practiced dance. The linen nightshirt, if one owned such a luxury, was slipped on last, already warmed by proximity to the fire or a heated stone. Warming the bed was more than a convenience. It was a necessity, and one of the most delicate tasks in the nightly ritual. The servant in charge of the warming pan walked a fine line. Too quick, and the sheets remained icy. Too slow, and the risk of embers scorching the fabric, or worse, starting a fire, became very real. These pans were made of brass or copper, filled with coals pulled carefully from the hearth. The pan was slid between the sheets and moved in slow, methodical strokes. Smoke sometimes escaped, infusing the bedclothes with the scent of ash and heat. That smell-burnt wood and metal became part of the identity of sleep itself. If the household lacked a warming pan, other methods were used. Stones, heated until they threatened to crack, were wrapped in thick cloth and placed beneath blankets. Bottles filled with hot water were rare but cherished when available. In some homes, the family dog was the warming pan, slipping beneath the covers on command and curling tightly near a master's legs. Children, too, served this purpose for each other, nesting instinctively into the warmest spot they could find. Once the bed was ready, the rest of the room needed attention. Drafts had to be managed. Fabric was stuffed into the cracks between door and frame. In wealthier homes, servants stuffed rags into the joints of wooden shutters or used moss to plug holes in the stone walls. Tapestries hung not for elegance but insulation, their thickness offering a barrier between flesh and frost. Every object in the room had been moved, hung, or chosen with one purpose, to make it survivable. And then came the drinks. Warm ale, spiced wine, or milk boiled with honey and herbs, all served as both comfort and prescription. These drinks didn't just calm the mind, they fueled the body for the battle ahead. A warm liquid raised the core temperature, if only briefly, and many believed that sleeping on a hot stomach made the rest of the body less vulnerable. In some medical texts, this was advised as standard treatment for winter malaise. Recipes included ingredients thought to ward off chill or illness. Cloves for circulation, nutmeg for digestion, even raw eggs stirred in for strength. The taste didn't matter. What mattered was the heat. Prayer followed. Quiet, mumbled, often half-finished, not because of a lack of reverence, but because the cold bit too deeply to linger. Blessings were whispered for protection against not only cold, but nightmares, spirits, and death itself. For many, sleep was not a neutral state. It was dangerous. It left the body still and the soul exposed. People shielded themselves with signs of the cross, recited familiar verses, or placed charms beneath pillows, bits of metal, sprigs of protective herbs, or even small carvings of saints. The layering of fabric was mirrored by a layering of meaning, of memory, of belief. The room finally settled into quiet, but it was not peace. Even in bed, movement remained deliberate. Blankets had to be pulled in the correct order. The heaviest went on top, then layered furs, then a final wrap for the feet. The curtains were drawn tightly shut. Some chambers had iron curtain rods and thick velvet or wool drapes to trap warmth. Others managed with coarse linens or patched quilts. Light was extinguished slowly, if at all. In many homes, at least one candle burned until the last person lay down, its flicker a small rebellion against the dark. Sleep itself came in waves. It was rarely continuous. People expected to wake at intervals, sometimes to check on the fire, sometimes to shift positions as limbs went numb. For mothers, sleep was interrupted by the stirrings of children or the whimper of a baby needing to be pressed between bodies for warmth. For fathers, it was often a cough, a creak in the wall, or the sharp memory of work left unfinished. The quiet of the castle was deceptive. It concealed 1,000 interruptions. Those who could afford it employed servants to rise in the middle of the night and tend the fire. This was a privileged job in name only. It meant creeping across icy stone, lifting the fire screen, blowing softly into the embers, and hoping they hadn't died. Rekindling a fire from scratch at midnight was no small task. The smoke stung the eyes, the cold stiffened the fingers, and the quiet made every motion sound like a thunderclap. And yet, without this effort, the chamber would freeze by morning. For those without servants, or the will to rise, stones cooled. Blankets lost their trapped warmth. The air within the bed canopy, once a refuge, thinned and sharpened. Many turned to each other instinctively, drawing close not out of love or lust, but instinct. In the hierarchy of human needs, warmth always came first. These rituals weren't performed with romanticism. They were mechanical, necessary, ingrained. Generations learned them by example. You didn't question the order in which things were done. You just did them the way your parents had and their parents before them. It was a cultural memory rooted not in comfort, but in survival. What's more telling is how little the rituals changed across class. The wealthy and the poor prepared differently, yes, but the intent was the same. Everyone feared the cold. Everyone knew its reach. Everyone understood that the night did not simply pass. It had to be endured, negotiated, and, on good nights, survived. And so the medieval person's relationship with night was never passive. It was defensive, proactive, and charged with effort. Sleep was not an escape. It was a fragile ceasefire. One wrong step, one missed ritual, and the cold would breach the walls again, as it always did. And the cold always returned. That was the part no one ever forgot. No matter how carefully the rituals were performed, how many layers were laid down, or how brightly the fire had burned that evening, the cold found its way back. It crept beneath the bed curtains, curled itself into the folds of thick wool, and settled into the corners of stone walls like mould. It wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was a presence, a quiet, persistent weight that reminded you, hour after hour, that you were never really warm, only less cold than before. There are stories, half lost, passed down through chroniclers and old estate records of people waking in the middle of the night to find their blankets stiff with frost. Not snow, not rain, but a thin, crackling layer of ice formed by breath and condensation inside sealed chambers. In rooms with no hearth, this wasn't rare. A shallow pan of water left overnight would crust at the edges. The walls would sweat in the cold, and even metal bed frames, for those rich enough to afford them, would gather a biting chill. Stone held cold longer than it held silence, and both wrapped around the sleeper like another shroud. Even dreams were shaped by it. Cold slipped into the unconscious mind, distorting sleep into something jagged. People dreamed of sinking into snowbanks, of wandering lost through icy woods, of fires they could never reach. There were whispered tales of night spirits, beings that rode the wind, slip through the tiniest cracks in castle mortar, and breathe frost onto the cheeks of infants. Most people knew better than to speak of them in daylight, but in the dark, as curtains flapped and frost patterns danced on the oiled windows, the imagination filled the silence with things colder than death. The psychological toll of this nightly dread ran deep. It shaped how people thought about the world, how they organized their spaces, how they spoke about comfort and safety. In modern times, we equate sleep with healing, peace, recovery. But to the medieval mind, sleep was more like a gamble. Each night was a crossing, and you had to earn the right to make it through. Warmth was never guaranteed, you fought for it. With fire, with furs, with rituals, with bodies pressed together like logs in a hearth. This struggle influenced architecture itself. Grand halls were designed for spectacle, not for living. Their ceilings arched high above fires that couldn't touch them. Heat rose and vanished, useless. So people began adapting. Smaller side chambers were retrofitted for winter use. Some were lined with wooden paneling, not for beauty, but to create an insulating layer of air between the stone and the human occupant. Rugs were placed on walls, not just floors. Windows were covered in multiple layers, shutters, fabric, oiled cloth, anything to dull the endless whistling of winter wind. In the wealthiest estates, specialized winter rooms emerged. These were compact, low-ceilinged, tucked away in the inner folds of the building where heat could be trapped. Here, sleep became more bearable. Yet even in these rooms, the rituals remained unchanged. A warming pan still passed over the sheets. Furs were still stacked in layers. Footrats were bound tightly. Because the enemy wasn't just cold, it was expectation. Let your guard down, and the night punished you. This was why fires, even inefficient ones, were tended like sacred flames. The act of banking the coals at night, pressing ashes over embers to preserve them until morning, was done with reverence. In some households, there were servants whose only task was to maintain these embers, to keep the fire alive without fanning it into wasteful flame. To let it go cold was not just a failure, it was a disgrace, a quiet shame that lingered like smoke in the fabric of the room. Among the poorer classes, the fire became a communal anchor. People huddled close. Not just families, but neighbours, strangers, anyone who needed a space to warm their hands before the long night ahead. Sleep in these cottages was even more collective than among the noble. Shared bedding, shared breath, shared body heat. There was no privacy, but there was survival. The animals, too, were part of this arrangement. Chickens roosted in corners, goats wandered freely. A pig might nestle near the foot of the bed. Their warmth was real, their stink inescapable, and their presence reassuring. People learned to recognize the sound of the night settling, the crack of ice forming on a wall beam, the sigh of a dying fire, the occasional muffled cough from a sleeping child. These sounds were the heartbeat of the dark. You listened for them not because they were pleasant, but because their absence meant something had gone wrong. When silence grew too deep, people stirred. They rose from bed not to stretch or to find water, but to check the fire, to wrap a sleeping body that had kicked off too many blankets, to chase off the cold before it found its next target. The castle, the cottage, the monastery, they were all different sizes of the same battlefield. And the cold, it never changed. It's hard to convey just how much of a person's energy went into simply surviving the night. Daylight brought work, certainly, but night demanded devotion. Every log of wood stacked by the hearth had been chosen with care. Every stitch of linen, every scrap of fur, every handful of moss stuffed into a wall crack, it all spoke of a relentless campaign, the kind that doesn't make it into history books. But it was the history that people lived. And yet, despite all of this, medieval people didn't walk around miserable. They sang songs while tending fires. They told stories as they sewed quilts. They passed on recipes for warming drinks with pride. Children grew up learning how to twist cloth just right to stuff into a window frame. Lovers whispered beneath the blankets, not just to share secrets, but to conserve breath. There was joy, hard-earned, buried beneath layers of hardship, but joy nonetheless, because every morning that followed one of these freezing nights was proof that they'd beaten the cold again. So when you imagine a medieval bed, don't think of romance. Think of resistance. And when you picture a castle chamber glowing with torchlight, Remember that the glow didn't reach the corners, that beyond the curtain the air was biting, and that someone right then was wrapping their child's feet in wool and whispering a prayer for just a few more degrees of warmth before dawn. They whispered for warmth, not comfort, and by the time dawn teased the edges of the sky, breath had become visible, even beneath the canopy. But the human body was not the only source of heat in the medieval night. To survive the deepest cold, people turned to companions that didn't speak, didn't judge, and didn't care about rank or status, animals. They weren't just tolerated in sleeping spaces, they were essential. In the high towers of noble estates and the cramped corners of peasant huts, animals served as the unsung heaters of the night. Dogs were the most welcome. They were loyal, quiet, and warm. Large breeds, mastiffs, hunting hounds, and sheepdogs could generate substantial body heat. Their instinct to curl at a person's feet made them natural foot warmers, their thick coats forming a barrier against the creeping cold. In many households, dogs were trained to sleep in bed, not as pets, but as living tools of survival. They didn't need to be told twice. The warmth of shared blankets was as much a reward for them as it was a necessity for their humans. Among nobles, this relationship was somewhat veiled in ceremony. Hunting dogs might be kept in the kennels by day, but as winter deepened, a favoured hound might find its way into the master's chamber. Records from estate inventories and personal journals mentioned bed dogs, a term that sounds affectionate, but was entirely functional. These were animals selected specifically to share a person's sleeping space, prized not just for their temperament, but for their ability to lie still and provide heat without disturbing sleep. Cats too played their part, though more often in peasant homes and monasteries than noble bedrooms. While they were celebrated for their ability to control vermin, their presence on the bed was also a comfort. A curled-up cat on the chest or nestled in the crook of an arm radiated warmth with surprising efficiency. Their purring, steady and low, provided a kind of acoustic insulation against the rattling wind and shifting timbers. They didn't obey commands. They didn't need to. They came where it was warm, and so they stayed where it was needed most. But the story didn't stop at companion animals. Livestock, often confined to pens or lean-tos during the day, were sometimes brought indoors at night. In peasant cottages, this wasn't considered strange or even inconvenient. It was the architecture of necessity. The cow was tied near the hearth. Goats wandered the floor, their hooves muffled by straw. Chickens roosted in rafters or huddled in corners. The pig, warm and immovable, lay just outside the bed, radiating heat like a crude furnace. Their breath thickened the air. Their scent saturated the room, but their bodies made the space livable. There's a raw practicality in this arrangement that defies modern sensibilities. Today, we speak of cleanliness and boundaries, of distinct places for people and animals. But in the medieval world, warmth overruled all. The line between man and beast blurred, not philosophically but physically. You reached for warmth, and whether it came from a fur blanket or a snoring goat didn't matter. The goal was not hygiene. The goal was to wake up alive. Still, these arrangements came with trade-offs. Where animals slept, parasites followed. Fleas, lice, and mites made no distinction between hosts. If the dog had them, the child beside the dog soon would too. Blankets crawled, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes in waves. Hair was inspected daily. Bedding was beaten outdoors when weather allowed. But full elimination was rare. People learned to live with pests because they had no other option. The cold could kill. Lice merely annoyed. It was an easy equation. There's a passage in a 14th century household record from Burgundy describing a family that rotated which animals slept closest to the hearth each night, based on the needs of the family. The youngest children were always closest to the warmest point, followed by the eldest, then the parents. The animals filled in the outer ring, forming a barrier of heat and breath. It reads like a survival diagram drawn not in ink, but in straw and sweat. This wasn't laziness or superstition, it was logistics. In monasteries, the role of animals was less visible, but just as crucial. Monks slept in communal dormitories, rows of cots or pallets arranged with military precision. Heat was generated through proximity, but even then the cold penetrated. There are documented instances of monasteries keeping cats in the sleeping quarters, not for warmth alone, but to deter rats from crawling into beds at night. Some monks wrote of the comfort these creatures brought, a small softness in a life otherwise shaped by stone and silence. Even in the military world, animals had their place in the sleeping arrangements. Soldiers billeted in castles or camped in wooden barracks during winter often allowed dogs to sleep among them. Horses, too, brought inside for safety, gave off tremendous heat. Soldiers wrapped themselves in cloaks, pressed shoulder to shoulder, sometimes lying with their backs to the horse's side to steal a bit of warmth. It was messy. It was loud. It smelled of sweat and leather and animal hide, but no one complained. In larger castles, there was more space to divide human and animal quarters, but that didn't mean people did. The most seasoned household managers knew that letting a dog sleep in the kitchen, where fires burned longest, could save a child's life. Letting a cat nest in the linens meant fewer bites in the night. The boundaries that modern life erects didn't exist here. Walls were not as firm as they seemed. Cold dissolved them. There were also superstitions around which animals were considered good to sleep beside. Dogs were almost universally accepted as loyal and protective. Pigs, while smelly, were seen as symbols of abundance and warmth. Cats, however, occupied an ambiguous space. In some regions, their nighttime presence was considered lucky, especially black cats, which were believed to absorb negative energy. In others, they were viewed with suspicion. Their quietness, their eyes glowing in the dark, led to associations with witchcraft and nocturnal demons. Yet even in these places, people let them stay in bed, because warmth overruled fear. This instinct to include animals in the nightly ritual wasn't just functional, it was deeply emotional. The soft weight of a dog against your legs, the purr of a cat near your ribs, the warm stench of a familiar animal beside your sleeping child, these were comforts in a world that gave so few. And when sleep came, broken though it might be, it came through this intermingling of lives, man, beast, and parasite, huddled together beneath the same threadbare quilt. When dawn arrived, when fires were rekindled and bodies stirred, people rose not just from sleep, but from a shared negotiation with the elements. And somewhere in the room, a dog stretched and yawned, a goat snorted, a child giggled as a cat climbed over blankets. The cold had not won. Not that night. The cold had not won, but it never truly lost either. It merely retreated, waiting for the moment when comfort bred complacency. And in that moment, warmth and filth became inseparable companions. This was the final layer of the medieval sleeping experience, the compromise with dirt, the truce with pests, the quiet, crawling acceptance that if survival required warmth, and warmth required animals, then cleanliness could not be a priority. In the war against winter, people didn't just tolerate discomfort, they invited it beneath their blankets. Fleas were a constant, especially where animals shared sleeping quarters. They travelled easily from dog to man, goat to child, bed to clothing. Linen could be washed, but rarely was in winter. Water froze, soap was scarce. Fires were precious and already strained by cooking and heating. Washing bedding, even for the wealthy, was a seasonal affair, and so fleas nested freely. They weren't invisible. People felt them, scratched at them, killed them when they could, but they were accepted, like wood smoke or creaking beams, part of the nighttime background noise. Lice were even more persistent. Unlike fleas, they didn't depend on animals. They lived in seams of clothing, in hair, in the folds of bed curtains and the corners of mattresses. Entire manuals were written on how to manage them. Dusting powders made of crushed herbs, combs of specific spacing, rituals for boiling clothes. But in winter, boiling wasn't an option. Fires were already rationed, and so lice too were endured, not without complaint, but without the illusion that they could be eradicated. There's an account from an English manor where a visiting noblewoman requested fresh bedding every 2 nights, not because of vanity, but because her dogs brought fleas so persistently into the room that by the 3rd night her servants refused to enter without gloves. She was not scorned for this, she was admired for her discipline. That's how deeply the problem ran. Even the cleanest homes, the richest chambers, the most attentive households, none were immune. Peasants, with far fewer resources, lived in deeper compromise. Bedding was rarely changed, often shared, and layered with whatever materials could be found. Old sacks. worn cloaks, tanned hides. Warmth came first. If the straw beneath was damp, if it smelled of animal waste or mould, so be it. If you woke scratching, it meant you had lived through another night. Vermin were not merely tolerated, they were recontextualized. A child with flea bites on their ankles was a child who had slept beside something warm. A man with lice was a man who hadn't frozen. This constant presence of pests affected not only comfort, but belief. People began to associate lice and fleas with the body's balance of humours. Too much cold, they thought, slowed the digestion and caused vapours to rise, which in turn bred insects. Remedies were sometimes medical, sometimes mystical. One chronicler describes a woman sleeping with garlic cloves tucked in her socks to keep the blood warm and the lice uninterested. Another claims that hanging a dried frog over the bed would draw fleas from the skin by morning. Strange, yes, but rooted in a logic shaped by desperation. The line between superstition and routine blurred easily in the medieval night. People believed that lice might be punishment for impure thoughts or signs of a bad winter ahead. Others thought that certain individuals, children born under the wrong astrological sign for instance, were more prone to attracting parasites. These beliefs weren't laughed off. They were whispered in seriousness, passed from mother to daughter, from servant to child. And every night, as people tucked themselves into beds where insects already waited, they hoped they'd followed the right rituals to keep the worst of them away. And yet, in the face of all this, people adapted. They shook out their bedding before lying down. They burned sweet herbs when they could. Lavender, thyme, and wormwood were especially popular, believed to confuse insects or even kill them outright. In monasteries where order was sacred, bedding was hung outdoors on rare sunny days to be aired out, even if the frost returned the moment it touched fabric. These weren't solutions. They were delays. But delays were victories when the battle was fought nightly. Oddly enough, this shared discomfort became its own form of community. When everyone itched, no one was ashamed. Children scratched openly. Servants laughed about fleas in their masters' socks. Monks wrote dry jokes about lice in the margins of prayer books. There was a kind of solidarity in the suffering. Everyone knew the rules of the game. Everyone agreed not to pretend otherwise. In the wealthiest homes, efforts to separate from the insect world became more elaborate. Tapestries were not just insulation, they were barriers. Bed hangings were washed with wine or vinegar. Guests were sometimes provided with fresh sleeping garments to prevent their own fleas from infecting the host's linens. Some castles had rooms set aside solely for airing beds, with charcoal braziers used to smoke out vermin. And yet, even here, the problem persisted. One French noble famously remarked that he judged a good bed not by its comfort, but by how long he could sleep before the lice woke him. What mattered more than eradication was control. Could you keep the pests at bay long enough to sleep? Could you warm the bed enough to forget the scratching for an hour or two? Could you convince yourself that waking up with insect bites was better than waking up frozen? Most nights, the answer was yes. And so, the medieval bed remained a layered contradiction. It was a place of ritual and refuge, of filth and protection, of pest and prayer. It was where bodies sought peace in the least peaceful conditions, where people huddled with dogs and goats, wrapped in sweat-stained furs, beneath ceilings stained black with smoke, where dreams curled into themselves like the sleepers did, tight, small, and often interrupted, because even with every blanket in place, every ember glowing, every charm hanging from the beam above, something always stirred. A flea beneath the collar, a mouse in the rushes, the breath of an animal pressed against your legs. Sleep was never total, comfort was never complete, and yet it happened. Night after night, somehow, people endured. And in the morning, when the curtain was pulled back, when the air slacked you awake, when the fire was coaxed back into life, those who had survived rose and began again. They brushed straw from their sleeves, picked at bites on their ankles, and retucked the blankets, knowing they would be back under them soon enough. Not for rest, but for the nightly truce with cold and cruel that passed, just barely, for sleep. Sleep passed, just barely, for survival. But no matter how thick the blankets, how tight the curtains, how many animals huddled nearby, There was always one adversary that slipped past every defense. It didn't need a door. It didn't need an invitation. It came in silence and touched every surface, every limb, every breath. It was the draft. Invisible, inescapable, and in many ways more feared than even the presence of vermin or the weight of lice. Because a draft wasn't a nuisance. A draft could kill. It's difficult for the modern imagination to appreciate how much damage a simple current of cold air could do in a stone structure built more for warfare than for wellness. The walls were thick, yes, but thickness wasn't insulation. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it even more slowly, which in a medieval winter meant rooms that remained cold long after fires were lit. And within these spaces, the tiniest crack, the smallest gap in a shutter or a floorboard, could become a passageway for wind that sliced through the air like a blade. People feared these currents deeply. The word draft doesn't carry the same weight now, but in the medieval world it signified more than discomfort. It signified danger. Stories spread of infants who caught chill in the night and never stirred again, of elders who slept too close to a wall, their joints stiffened by the cold until they couldn't rise. There were rules about where to place the bed, how far it should be from the outer wall, which direction the curtain should face to deflect the worst of the breeze. These weren't traditions. They were tactics. And still, the drafts came. Windows were the most obvious culprit. In castles, glass was rare, expensive, and largely symbolic. Where it existed, it was small and thick, held in lead frames and prone to cracking under frost. Most windows were open spaces covered with oiled linen or thin panels of translucent horn, both of which distorted light and dulled sound, but neither of which offered true protection against the wind rattled in their frames. They flapped like sails when the weather turned harsh. During storms, they sang a mournful, breathy sound that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. In lower-class homes, windows were often just holes, closed only by wooden shutters or fabric nailed in place. These were covered at night with anything that came to hand. Old cloaks, spare rugs, even flattened sacks. But wood shrank in the cold, fabric stiffened, and wind found a way. People stuffed moss or straw into the edges, tucked rags beneath the window boards, piled furniture against the openings to create artificial barriers. They did everything but eliminate the opening entirely, because to do that would trap smoke, dampen air, and invite other hazards. Ceilings were no better. They were rarely finished in the way we understand today. In peasant homes, the roof was often thatch-woven reeds or straw packed tightly over beams, with gaps inevitable over time. In castles, wooden beams supported stone vaulting or simple planks, sometimes painted, sometimes left bare. Heat rose toward these ceilings but rarely returned. Instead, it disappeared into the architecture, leaving only condensation and a steady drip of cold that descended like punishment. It wasn't unusual for people to wake to frost clinging to the ceiling beams, or for sheets to stiffen where breath had gathered in the folds. Some households tried to combat this with smoke. Fires burned low through the night, not just for warmth but to fill the upper parts of the room with smoke that slowed the loss of heat. Of course, this came at a cost. People coughed. Their eyes burned, their lungs blackened with time. But it was a compromise they accepted. A slow death by smoke was still preferable to a fast one by freezing. Even the floors turned against sleepers. Stone was merciless. Wood rotted and warped with moisture. Rushes, laid down to provide some comfort underfoot, became breeding grounds for mold and insects. They trapped moisture in their layers, rotted from below, and smelled of old wool and rot. And yet, they were necessary. Without them, every step was a reminder that you were walking directly on winter's bones. People swept the rushes weekly, added fresh herbs, sometimes covered them with cloth to slow the chill, but it was always a losing battle. The bed's position in the room became a matter of science. If you were too close to the window, the draft would blow directly over your face. Too close to the outer wall, the chill from the stone would bleed through the mattress. Too far from the fire, and you'd freeze before midnight. Too close to the hearth, and you risked smoke, sparks, or burns. People learned the sweet spot by feel, not formula. It wasn't written down. It was handed down, whispered from parent to child. Place the headboard near the inner wall, let the feet face the fire, Never let the curtain touch the floor where the draft is strongest. But not everyone had choices. Servants slept where they could, in corridors, beside doors, near stairwells where wind tunneled through like it had a purpose. Children shared makeshift beds tucked into alcoves. Soldiers slept in rows across wooden planks or straw mats, lined shoulder to shoulder in freezing barracks where air slipped between roof tiles and swept the warmth away like a thief. Their only protection was each other, the breath of the man beside you, the collective mass of cloaks piled on top. Still, some didn't wake, not because of wounds, but because the wind found them before dawn. People developed an almost mystical respect for drafts. They talked about them as if they were alive. The way they moved, always unexpected. The sounds they made, always unsettling. A quiet whistle in the corner of the room could raise the hairs on your neck faster than a wolf's howl, because it meant the defences had failed, that somewhere something had shifted, a board had shrunk, a curtain had blown aside, and the cold had found its way back in. And there were deeper fears too. Some believed that drafts carried spirits, that the dead rode on sudden gusts that blew through closed chambers, that a cold wind brushing your cheek while you slept was not just weather, but a visitation, a warning. These were not fringe beliefs. They were embedded in the cultural psyche. When children asked why the wind howled at night, their parents didn't speak of air pressure or changing temperatures. They said it was the ancestors, knocking to remind you to respect the old ways, so people obeyed. They sealed, they braced, they prepared. And still, they felt that invisible finger run along their spines when the room grew too still, too sharp, too quiet. Because you can fight vermin with herbs, you can outweight lice with patience, you can warm a bed with dogs and stones and furs. But a draft? A draft slips in while you're not looking. It doesn't ask. It doesn't hesitate. It cuts. And all the rituals in the world can't always stop what you can't see. Not just uncomfortable. They were deadly vectors of imbalance, capable of turning a healthy body into a corpse by morning. The dominant medical theory of the time, rooted in Galenic traditions, revolved around the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to medieval physicians, these humours were sensitive to changes in weather, diet, and especially temperature. Cold air, particularly when it came uninvited and unnoticed, was believed to disturb the internal equilibrium of the body. It thickened the blood, it clogged the lungs, it slowed digestion and dulled the senses. A person exposed to a draft while sleeping might wake with a cough, or worse, might not wake at all. This belief wasn't seen as superstition. It was science, at least for the time, and it drove every architectural decision, every sleeping habit, every nighttime ritual. Medical texts warned not to sleep with the window uncovered, to avoid placing a bed near outer walls, to never leave your chest or feet exposed to the air at night. Even warm, dry air could be dangerous if it moved the wrong way. A sudden breeze could trigger imbalance. Illness didn't need a contagion, it only needed a breeze. To counter this, medieval architects, at least those building for the elite, began experimenting with chamber design. Some castles included winter apartments, compact rooms with lower ceilings, thicker walls, fewer windows, and tighter doors. These weren't just for comfort. They were designed as health chambers. The less space there was to fill, the easier it was to maintain warmth. Some noble families relocated entirely during the cold months, leaving their grand halls and sprawling chambers behind to huddle in smaller, central spaces closer to kitchens or stables where heat accumulated. Panelling became another line of defense. Wooden walls added later to older stone buildings didn't just serve aesthetic purposes, they acted as a thermal buffer. A narrow pocket of air trapped between the stone and the panel could blunt the worst of the cold and slow down invading drafts. Oak and pine were favoured for this, not only for durability, but because their resinous scent masked the musty chill that settled over damp stone. Some rooms were entirely refitted in this way, a clear shift from status display to climate control. In households that couldn't afford panelling, or in cases where it wasn't possible due to architectural constraints, servants stuffed the cracks instead. Every gap between floorboard and wall, every seam around a window, every hinge that didn't close flush was plugged with whatever material was available. moss, rags, straw, even old bits of parchment. These were temporary fixes, but necessary ones. A chambermaid might spend hours preparing a room for sleep, not with fluffing or decorating, but with plugging and sealing and shielding against the air that came alive at night. The consequences of failure were real and visible. Chroniclers wrote about nobles who caught a chill and lingered in bed for weeks before succumbing to winter sickness. Children who coughed through one stormy night and were buried before the snow thawed. Entire families that moved to the warmer south chamber only after losing a relative to a poorly sealed window. And yet, no one blamed carelessness. They blamed the draft. It had a kind of agency. It punished inattention. It was not a condition. It was an adversary. Medical remedies focused obsessively on prevention. People were advised to oil their feet before bed, to wrap their limbs in wool, to drink warm liquids spiced with cinnamon, cloves or honey to keep the internal fires burning. A favourite remedy among English households was warm milk mixed with ginger and nutmeg, taken just before sleep to guard the lungs. Others preferred heated wine infused with rosemary or thyme, both believed to stimulate circulation and ward off melancholy, the emotional cousin of cold. For those who could afford it, professional physicians provided even more elaborate prescriptions. Foot rubs with warmed goose fat, sleeping with a heated iron brick wrapped in linen, placing warm stones in the corners of the room to stabilize the temperature. And for the very wealthy, imported bed linens soaked in oils or waxes that helped seal in body heat. These weren't extravagances, they were medicine. They were armour against a night that never showed mercy. Yet even with these precautions, the draft could not be entirely banished. People adapted emotionally as well. They learned to interpret sensations that today we would ignore. A sudden chill on the nape of the neck meant the curtain had shifted. A sting in the toe signalled that the warming stone had cooled too soon. A ripple in the bed hangings meant a crack had reopened. Their bodies were instruments finely tuned to cold, and they reacted quickly, instinctively, because slowness could be dangerous. This sensitivity to airflow became part of culture. In literature, a sudden draft often signalled an ominous shift, a death approaching, a ghost entering, a betrayal lurking. Air was the first warning. Its movement, subtle as it was, carried weight. People trusted their skin more than their eyes when it came to changes in the room, and they passed this awareness down. Parents didn't just teach children to dress warmly. They taught them to feel the air, to know when something had changed. Even in spiritual practices, this attention to drafts held meaning. Some believed that open air at night left the soul vulnerable to wandering spirits, that while the body slept, a breeze could invite in something less welcome. Protective charms were often hung near places where wind might enter. A small iron key above the window, a sprig of dried juniper tucked into the bed frame, a whispered blessing spoken as the last curtain was drawn. Not because people were superstitious, but because they understood that vulnerability is both physical and unseen. So when the wind rose late at night, and the fire burned low, and the coals began to dim beneath their ash, medieval people didn't simply sleep through it. They stirred. They listened. They checked the edges of the room, fingers trailing the walls, feeling for a breath of air that didn't belong. And when they found it, when a shutter had shaken loose or a curtain slipped, they didn't panic. They plugged it, patched it, braced it, and returned to bed, grateful not for perfect safety, but for the small victory of resisting what had come to take their warmth. Because warmth was not comfort, it was life. And a draught was not inconvenience, it was a reminder that life, once lost to cold, didn't always come back. And so sleep, that thing we now associate with peace and restoration, was rarely either in the medieval world. It came in fits, in fragments, in shallow waves that crested only to crash under the weight of cold air, shifting bedding, or the urgent cough of someone nearby. In fact, no one planned for it. They didn't call it rest, they called it lying down, and lying down was not surrender. It was waiting, watching, half-conscious negotiation with the darkness that pressed against the walls and seeped under the door. Interrupted sleep was the norm, not the exception. Entire manuals from the period speak casually of segmented nights, divided not just by need, but by design. What modern science calls biphasic sleep was once deeply embedded into the culture. People went to bed early, just after sunset or once the fire was safely banked, and slept until midnight or a little after. Then they woke, not briefly, but often for an hour or two, sometimes longer. During this time they prayed, read if literate, performed quiet tasks, or even visited neighbours. Some used the time for sex, others to check on livestock or the condition of the fire. Then they returned to bed for their second sleep, which carried them until dawn if they were lucky. But luck was rare. Sleep was always tentative, always perched on the edge of interruption. The cold was one reason, but so was the world around them. Castles groaned at night, wood shifted as it contracted, rafters popped and thudded as wind pushed against roof lines. Mice scurried through the rushes, dogs barked in their dreams. A stone dislodged in the courtyard could sound, in the quiet, like a siege. Servants rose to tend embers. Monks moved silently to early prayers, and in towns, the occasional scream or shout from a drunken passerby cut through the stillness like a blade. Within households, sleep was no more private. Children stirred and rolled. Infants cried. Older relatives wheezed in their sleep or woke coughing blood. There was no isolation in the medieval night. If one person woke, everyone did. And no one was embarrassed by it. It was a part of life. Beds creaked. Blankets were adjusted. Dogs were hushed. The fire was stoked again. Sometimes a shared bowl of warm ale or broth was passed around before settling back into blankets. The night's rhythm briefly reset. For those with servants, interruption became a managed experience. Someone else was tasked with rising, with feeding the fire, checking the shutters, walking the hall with a lantern to make sure all was as it should be. These tasks were lowly but vital. To miss a fire check was to let the embers die. To ignore a draught was to risk illness. Many castle servants were chosen not for strength but for alertness. The ability to wake quickly, walk silently, and make small repairs or adjustments without waking the rest of the house. That was a valued skill. But even in noble homes, the interruption was rarely graceful. Chambers that had fallen quiet hours earlier would be disturbed again and again by minor chaos. A spill, a child vomiting from spoiled food, a dog growling at something unseen. The sound of a log falling in the hearth could echo like thunder in a walled chamber. And because people feared both physical and spiritual threats in the night, these noises were rarely shrugged off. They were investigated. Carefully, quietly. A man waking to a sudden noise might sit still for several minutes, listening to the silence that followed, trying to decide whether it was worth moving. There were no electric lights, no switches to flip. A candle left burning wasted wax. A torch consumed valuable wood. Some households allowed one ember-fed lamp to glow through the night, but even this had to be monitored. Fires were dangerous. In cities, entire streets had gone up in flames from a knocked-over taper. In castles, where fabric wall hangings and wooden floors waited to catch fire, the consequences were even greater. So people learned to live with the dark. They memorized the shapes of their rooms, learned how to navigate by touch. They felt for chamber pots, for the cold edge of the table, for the heavy curtain tie that marked the bedpost. And they did it all without thinking, without waking fully, because if you stirred too much, if you left the bed for too long, the cold would find you again. Interrupted sleep wasn't just physical, it was mental. People dreamed differently, woke often enough that dreams were remembered vividly, sometimes layered with each other, sometimes mistaken for visitations. Letters and journals from the period include references to dreams with startling clarity, of dead relatives speaking warnings, of strange beasts hovering above the bed, of icy wind entering through a window that had been sealed tight. These weren't treated as symbols, but as experiences. The line between dreaming and waking was thinner in those half-sleeps, and people learned to interpret what came to them in that space. Even spiritual leaders acknowledged this broken rhythm. Monasteries were built around it. The canonical hours, the divisions of night and day marked by prayer, interrupted sleep by design. Monks rose in the small hours to chant, to meditate, to walk in cold cloisters lit only by oil lamps. Their interrupted nights weren't seen as a burden, but a spiritual opportunity. Yet even outside the cloister, people adopted similar patterns. A merchant might use the break between sleeps to reflect. A farmer might quietly mend a tool or prepare the next day's bread. These were slow tasks, done without hurry, in the silence of those suspended hours. The idea of 8 hours of unbroken sleep would have seemed alien. Not impossible, but unusual. Reserved for the ill, the exhausted, or the unusually lucky. And yet, people didn't necessarily suffer from this. They adapted their expectations. They aligned with the season. In summer, nights were shorter and sleep more compressed. In winter, the dark ruled, and people surrendered to its fragmented rhythm. Waking wasn't failure, it was part of the design. Still, the accumulation of poor sleep had its effects. Fatigue showed in people's faces, in the slowness of morning routines, in the sag of shoulders at midday. Older people often napped during daylight hours, especially if the night had been restless. Children, worn out by the cold and the effort of warmth, could be found sleeping beside the hearth in the middle of the day. Servants leaned on broom handles. Monks dozed in the corners of the chapel between psalms. Sleep was never far away, but it never stayed long enough. And in all this there was no shame, no pressure to sleep like a log, no expectation to be fully rested every morning. People accepted that rest was partial, and recovery was a process. What mattered was surviving the night. What mattered was waking up again, however tired, and doing it all over. Because in the medieval world, to sleep was not to escape life. It was to keep walking through it, one broken hour at a time, one broken hour at a time. And within those hours, between the first sleep and the second, life continued, softened, slowed, but not still. The medieval night was never truly dormant. People used its fractured rhythm as part of their daily pattern, as practical time reclaimed from darkness. This was the space where small tasks lived, where whispered conversations unfolded, and where the rituals of body and spirit wove their quiet thread through the silence. Some rose because they had to. A servant stirred to check the fire, to stir the coals before they sank too low to save. A mother adjusted a child's blanket or lifted an infant to her breast. A farmer stood silently by the door, listening for the sounds of restless livestock. These weren't disruptions, they were expectations. Everyone had their role in managing the long hours between dusk and dawn. The fire needed feeding, the shutters needed checking, and in the rare stillness, thoughts needed sorting. But not all rose out of necessity. Many embraced the in-between time as an opportunity. For the literate and the privileged, it became a time for reading, by the dim light of a candle or an ember-warmed lamp. The hours after midnight were considered spiritually potent, and texts read then were thought to be better understood, as if the mind was more open when the world was hushed. Religious writings, poetry, letters, and household accounts all made their way into these strange, quiet pockets of productivity. Monks were not the only ones who moved through the shadows with purpose. For others, this was the time for prayer. Not the loud communal prayers of the day, but private whispers into the darkness. Prayers for health, for loved ones, for protection from the spirits that some still believed roamed at night. People knelt by bedsides, or prayed lying flat beneath layers of furs. They clutched charms, ran their fingers over carved beads or knotted cords, and murmured familiar words like a rhythm that held the dark at bay. For many, these prayers weren't just requests. They were part of the scaffolding that supported sleep itself. And then there were the more intimate rituals. It was well known, even accepted, that the hours between sleeps were often used for sex. Husbands and wives, pressed close beneath heavy blankets, found that the warmth of shared body heat combined with the drowsy vulnerability of the moment created a rare quiet space for closeness. Medical texts even recommended this timing, claiming that coupling during the second watch of the night promoted conception and healthier offspring. While such ideas were wrapped in the language of humours and bodily balance, the human impulse underneath was simple: connection in the cold. What's striking is how little shame was attached to these nocturnal interludes. Sleep wasn't considered sacred or inviolable in the way it sometimes is now. To wake in the night, to stir and speak, to share a meal, a thought, or a touch. These were not intrusions. They were life continuing in the dark. The night didn't shut life down. It just slowed its tempo, deepened its texture. In some homes, people even rose to eat. Not feasts, but small, intentional meals, a bit of bread, a bowl of broth, a warmed mug of ale or milk. In noble households, a servant might be expected to fetch a hot drink during the night if summoned. The rich had the means to maintain embers long enough for a quick heating. The poor prepared ahead, placing a pot near the fire, wrapped in cloth to retain some residual heat for this midnight pause. Eating at night wasn't indulgent. It was part of maintaining warmth, strength, and sometimes simply comfort. And while solitude was common during these hours, so was company. In communal homes, particularly among the lower classes, people spoke softly during these breaks. A husband asked his wife about tomorrow's plans. A grandmother told a quiet story to a child who had stirred and couldn't fall back to sleep. Even in monasteries, monks walking the cloisters during nocturnal prayer sometimes stopped to exchange murmured reflections before parting again into their own thoughts. There was, in all of it, a kind of respect for the dark, not reverence exactly, but an understanding that the night was not merely empty time. It was not a void to be endured. It was a different world with its own rules, its own mood, its own pacing. It asked for quiet, not silence. Activity, not noise. Thought, not speech. And within that request, people found their place. It's worth imagining the rooms themselves during these hours. A noble chamber, fire reduced to glowing embers, the outline of tapestries barely visible in the flicker. A single candle throws long shadows against the bed frame. Someone rises, pulls a robe over their shoulders, and pads across the rush-covered floor. A book is opened, its pages turning slowly. A servant sleeps curled near the hearth. A dog lifts its head, then settles again. Nothing is urgent, but nothing is forgotten. In a peasant cottage, the scene is humbler, but no less alive. The fire is little more than a smoulder. Someone stirs the pot hung over it, tasting to see if there's still warmth. The children sleep in a pile, feet tangled, one of them mumbling in their dreams. A goat shifts and grumbles in the corner. A man rubs his hands together, mutters about the frost, then wraps himself back in his cloak. He won't sleep again for a while, but that's fine. He'll keep watch. Not because of danger necessarily, but because that's what you do. Outside, the world remains still. Snow falls without sound. The wind drags itself over rooftops. Birds do not sing. And inside, people move slowly, aware that time is strange in these hours, stretching and folding in unpredictable ways. No one rushes to return to sleep. They know it will come, eventually, if the bed is still warm and the wind doesn't rise. These midnight hours were also when stories were born. The in-between world-inspired tales that blurred the line between waking and dreaming. Ghosts that visited just before the second sleep. Witches seen walking past the window when no one else was awake, a knock at the door that never happened. Even when no one spoke of these things, they lingered. Sleep, when it returned, carried their flavour. Dreams after midnight were different, deeper, closer to something people couldn't quite name. Eventually, the second sleep came. Sometimes slowly, sometimes as if a veil were drawn in an instant. People curled back beneath their covers. The fire flickered a few more times before going still. Dogs shifted, children sighed. And silence. The true, complete kind settled in for its brief reign before morning crept in to scatter it once again. The second sleep was not always better than the first. Sometimes it was lighter. Sometimes it felt like slipping into a shadow already past. But it was necessary. The world that waited at sunrise would not wait kindly for the unrested. Work began early. Water needed hauling, fires needed relighting, livestock needed tending, and bodies, no matter how sore or tired, were expected to rise. So when sleep returned, it was taken, gratefully. And when morning came, as it always did, those who had moved through the night's quiet middle rose not as victims of poor sleep, but as participants in a different kind of life, one measured not in hours slept, but in moments survived, in the steadiness of fire, in the closeness of breath, in the rare comfort of warmth that hadn't been stolen away. Survival itself. But survival came wrapped in scent. It curled through every chamber and lingered in every breath, forming an invisible map of who lived where, what they did, how well they lived, or how close to ruin they were. In a medieval castle, the smell of night wasn't a singular experience. It was a chorus of odours layered one over the other like bedclothes, rising and falling in strength, each carrying its own weight of memory, meaning, or decay. Smoke dominated everything. Even long after the hearths had died down and the embers ceased their flickering glow, The memory of fire lingered in the stone. Walls absorbed smoke like skin absorbs sweat. Drapes, wool, fur, and even bread were permeated by it. The scent was more than air. It was the architecture itself exhaling. It clung to hair, beards, and blankets. In the morning, when the first log cracked in the hearth, it didn't start a new smell. It simply reignited the one that never left. For those who lived within the keep, this wasn't unpleasant. It was familiar, protective, even sweet, in the way only a lived-in scent can be. But the smoke never travelled alone. It was always partnered with sweat, not the fleeting kind from labour, but the deep-set, soaked into the sheets kind. People didn't bathe daily or even weekly, and while this wasn't from neglect, it left its signature on every sleeping space. Mattresses were rarely cleaned. Night clothes were slept in, then worn again the next night, sometimes for weeks. Pores exhaled their salt. Breath carried traces of meat or mead. Feet were rarely washed. All of it combined into a rich, fermented hum that marked a bed as much as its carvings or its tapestries. To mitigate these odours, people turned to herbs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, mint, and even tansy were woven into mattress stuffing or strewn across rush-covered floors. Some chewed sprigs before bed or hung sachets near their pillows. The nobility might afford bags of spices imported from distant coasts, cloves, cinnamon, or dried orange peels, to lend their chambers an exotic tinge. But these were not fragrances layered over filth. They were tools of balance. They competed with decay, fought against rot, and reminded sleepers of gardens and sunlight and the promise of things that did not spoil. Animals added their own notes. Dogs were common bedfellows, and their musk was as much a part of the bedding as the wool itself. Cats curled up near feet, particularly in winter, their scent sharper but less clinging. In the poorer quarters, livestock might share the same room. Goats, chickens, even a piglet or two. Their odours didn't simply enter the sleeping space. They were part of it. They brought heat and the assurance of survival. Their manure was swept out each morning, but their presence never truly left. The smell reminded everyone, even in sleep, of the boundaries between life and death, feast and famine. There were worse smells still, ones not spoken of but deeply known. Mould in the wall, too quiet to notice until it soured the breath. The reek of spoiled food, hidden beneath a rush mat. The metallic tang of blood, if someone had died in the room and their body remained overnight. The sharp, stomach-turning edge of illness, which even the untrained could sense. These smells provoked silence. They were warnings. They said, "Be alert. Someone is dying. Something is wrong." And yet, the most haunting smell of all might have been absence. The smell of a cold bed, never warmed. Of clothing that still carried someone's scent long after they were gone. Of firewood unburned because no one had the strength to fetch more. The empty smell of loss. In a castle where the night could steal breath as easily as a thief, that absence weighed heavier than any presence. People responded to scent not with detachment, but intimacy. Mothers could identify children by the smell of their blankets. Lovers recognized one another in the dark, not by voice, but by the breath against their cheek. Servants could tell who had passed by which stairwell by the lingering trail of tallow, spice, or sweat. To be aware of scent was to be aware of life. To sleep in the medieval world was to inhale its full truth, and to remember it. Some scents were layered in ceremony. Before sleep, a mother might rub a child's chest with warmed oil scented with mint or clove. A priest might sprinkle rosewater on the sheets of a dying noble. An herbalist might fumigate a room with wormwood and rue to chase away spirits or sickness. These rituals were less about effectiveness and more about control drawing. A fragrant line between body and soul, illness and health, chaos and order. Sleep, they hoped, would fall on the right side of the line. And it wasn't just humans who reacted to smell in ritual. Animals responded too. Dogs growled when they caught the scent of something unfamiliar. Horses in stables shifted restlessly on nights when the air held the scent of wolves. Even the castle cats, ever indifferent, would lift their heads and stare at doorways that carried smells their humans could not decipher. The more one notices, the more impossible it becomes to ignore. A chamber pot that should have been emptied, a damp corner breeding mildew, a guest whose perfume masks desperation. All of it lives in the nose. And in a world where darkness fell hard and light was precious, smell became the first sense to wake, the last to rest, the guide through every corridor, both waking and sleeping. So, when the torch finally gutted out, and the only light left was the moon breathing silver through a tiny slit of a window, the last thing a person experienced wasn't sight or sound. It was scent. The lavender crushed beneath a shifting shoulder, the ash rising from a dying ember, the hair of a sleeping dog, the sour musk of feet, the breath of someone who would not survive till dawn, the memory of someone already gone. That was the medieval night, not dark, not silent, but known by the nose. Not dark, not silent, but known by the nose. And as the scent of the medieval night began to shift with the earliest hints of dawn, so too did the behaviours and expectations of those within the castle walls. Morning didn't come with alarms or synchronised clocks. It arrived slowly, in gradients of blue leaking through arrow slits, in the subtle shift of cold as the wind outside changed its tone. For light sleepers, and there were many, this was enough. They stirred, not because they had finished resting, but because their bodies had learned the cues of light and temperature. Others waited for sound, the first clatter of a servant's bucket, the distant cough of a stable boy, or the low murmur of priests gathering for matins. Waking wasn't immediate. It was a negotiation between warmth and duty. Many lay still for a while, wrapped in furs or coarse blankets, staring at ceilings they knew by heart. They didn't leap from bed. There was no glory in being first. Rising too quickly meant feeling the full bite of the chill air, especially in winter. Limbs stiff from cold took coaxing. The act of getting dressed was deliberate and slow. Clothes had been folded near the bed or left in a pile, still holding the shape of the previous day's movements. They were stiff with sweat, heavy with dust, often still damp, but they were familiar. And more importantly, they were warmer than fresh ones, if any such luxury existed. The process of preparing for the day began before sunrise for many, particularly servants and lower-tier workers. In noble households, a steward might already be walking the halls, inspecting fires, listening for leaks, smelling for rot. He would note who had risen early and who had not. A lady's maid would enter the chambers of her mistress softly, carrying a basin of water that steamed faintly, only lukewarm by the time it reached her. She might rub her mistress's hands to warm them, help her out of bed, and begin brushing out hair that had twisted into tangles overnight. These weren't rituals of vanity, but necessity. The day ahead would be hard, the weather cruel, and appearances mattered more than comfort. In communal halls the change was more abrupt. Young boys sleeping in shared quarters were often roused with a shake or a call. Older men might rise early out of habit, their joints aching too much to stay still. There was little privacy, so modesty gave way to routine. People dressed around each other, pulling on hose and tunics, rubbing warmth into their arms, muttering curses at the cold floor under bare feet. Morning greetings were rare. Voices were kept low. There was little reason to speak until one had food or fire, and yet the kitchen had already been alive for some time. Cooks and kitchen boys often woke in the deepest part of the night to begin preparations for the day's meals. Bread had to be kneaded and set to rise hours before first light. Fires had to be coaxed from coals. The heat built slowly and carefully, lest it flare too high and waste precious wood. Porridge, thick with oats and sometimes flavoured with honey if available, was stirred in large pots. Occasionally, a rabbit or small bird snared the day before would be prepped for a broth. The smell of warm food drifting from the kitchens was often the castle's first real announcement that day had begun. Water, cold and often murky, was used sparingly. Most wiped faces and hands with damp cloths. Full washing was rare and reserved for special days, religious observances, or illness. But the sense of cleanliness wasn't entirely absent. People brushed their teeth with twigs or rinsed with wine or ale. They rubbed scented herbs on their hands and faces. A clean tunic or a brushed cloak gave a sense of readiness, even if the body beneath hadn't seen soap in weeks. Morning routines diverged sharply depending on status. For the lord of the castle, the day might begin with a report from the steward, a look at the ledger, or discussion with a knight about patrols. For his lady, it might involve overseeing the linen stores, inspecting the herb garden, or managing correspondence with other households. Children, if not sent to monastery schools, were expected to begin chores early, sweeping, hauling water, tending animals. Their learning came through doing. Reading, for the few who learned it, came later, in brief lessons squeezed between labour. Monks, already deep into their day, moved between prayer and work in silence. They had no need for conversation, no desire for idle speech. Their discipline gave structure to time in a world where most people judged the hour by the sun's angle or the rooster's crow. Their chants echoed softly through stone corridors, a reminder that while many toiled, some chose to devote their every breath to ritual. And then there were the invisible ones, the labourers who lived on the edge of the castle grounds, blacksmiths who had begun heating metal before light, fletchers sharpening arrowheads, coopers reinforcing barrel rings. Their day began with hammer and flame. The sound of labour, of iron meeting iron, of wood splitting under pressure, soon filled the space between castle walls. It was not intrusive. It was expected. It was the heartbeat of the place. In all this, danger was never far away. A slip on the icy floor could break a limb. An unattended fire could eat through a timber beam. A spoiled bucket of milk could trigger illness. Every task carried risk, and every morning carried the weight of uncertainty. People moved with care, with muscle memory honed by repetition. And as they moved, they watched, listened, smelled. Because the night never truly ended. It simply changed its face. The dark corners of the castle still held secrets. The draught behind the tapestry still whispered. The tension in the bones of the walls remained. Morning light may have illuminated the rooms, but it didn't banish fear. It simply made it manageable. And so the day began. Not with bells or bright cheer, but with breath turned visible in the cold, with the scrape of wood on stone, with the silence of people too tired to speak. It began with survival reshaped into motion. The medieval morning wasn't about freshness or promise. It was about continuation, about bearing forward the weight of the night and hoping that, by the next, that weight might be lighter, or at least no heavier. About bearing forward the weight of the night and hoping that, by the next, that weight might be lighter, or at least no heavier. But the truth was, in a medieval castle, that burden rarely eased. If anything, it multiplied. Every day brought fresh responsibilities, and beneath the hierarchy of nobility and servitude lay a web of quiet endurance. Endurance not only of labour, but of expectation. Castles were not just homes. They were political machines, economic engines, and defensive structures. They breathed power, but it was a power built on countless, often invisible backs. Stone walls did not clean themselves. Rushes laid across floors to soak up spills, and filth were not decorative, they were essential. Women, mostly unseen by visiting dignitaries or wandering bards, spent their days replacing soiled rushes, boiling laundry in copper pots, and scraping wax from candlesticks with blunt knives. Fingers red from lye, nails cracked, eyes stinging from smoke, they moved through chambers like ghosts. Few remembered their names, but everyone relied on their absence being filled by efficiency. When they faltered, everything did. Then there were the children too young to work, yet old enough to notice. They learned by watching, by absorbing the rhythm of their elders' movements. They played with carved sticks, rough-spun dolls, and the occasional animal bone. But they also learned how to sweep, how to bow, when to remain silent. A boy might sneak into the stable, not for mischief, but to listen, to mimic how the farrier checked a horse's hooves, or how the older boys tied knots. A girl might stare too long at her mother's hands weaving, or her aunt's fingers mending a tear in the master's cloak, because one day her hands would be judged by how well they remembered. Hierarchy wasn't just vertical, it was atmospheric. The air changed when a lord entered a room. Servants stood straighter. Jokes stopped mid-laugh, eyes lowered. Not out of terror, always, but out of instinct. Deference wasn't about obedience. It was survival. knowing when to speak, when to disappear, and when to feign interest in a noble's dull story could be the difference between favour and punishment, or, worse, being forgotten entirely, a dangerous thing in a world where favours fed bellies. Meals became the day's punctuation, and not everyone's punctuation was the same. The Lord's table overflowed with bread, pottage, roasted meats, sometimes even fruits soaked in wine or sugar for special occasions. But even here, things weren't guaranteed. A hunt could fail, a shipment could spoil, a cook could misjudge the spice mix, a noble's bad mood could taint the feast. One wrong taste, one whispered accusation of spoiled meat could cost someone a hand or their position. Every dish carried risk. For the rest guards, servants, masons, boys training as squires, meals were often porridge, onions, beans and bread. If lucky, they got cheese. Rarer still, ale. Yet even this was not seen as suffering. Hunger redefined joy. A warm bowl, a generous portion, a surprise root vegetable in winter. These small triumphs lit the day. The castle's cooks knew their audience. They stretched scraps, saved bones for stock, reused drippings from the Lord's roast to flavour gruel for the children. Not out of charity, but out of necessity. Waste was the enemy. Food gone uneaten was insult, opportunity lost, and sometimes a sin. Time passed without clocks. Shadows moved across walls. The sun struck the stained glass windows of the chapel at different angles, marking prayers, calls to the garden, and the beginning of evening chores. Bells rang from the chapel or the watchtower, not to mark precise hours, but to announce moments, mass, labour, curfew. People understood the day by its soundscape. The clang of armour meant a patrol was forming. The scrape of buckets meant someone was drawing water from the well. Laughter in the inner courtyard meant children were practising with wooden swords. An essential skill, even for those who'd never fight. Weapons were never far from thought. In a castle, war was never just a rumour. Even in times of peace, drills continued. Walls were checked, oil stores inventoried, arrows counted. Squires learned to repair chainmail before they were trusted to wear it. They hauled shields larger than their torsos, ran up and down staircases with weighted sacks to build strength, and practised on straw dummies with blunted blades until their palms bled. They didn't complain. Bruises were medals. A cracked rib was a lesson. Pain was just another tutor. The castle's guards, veterans and green recruits alike, walked the ramparts by day and night. They observed not only the forest line or approaching visitors, but each other. A guard who nodded off might find himself replaced by someone younger. A man who missed a signal might be accused of cowardice. And cowardice, in such a world, was a form of rot. It spread. Leaders squashed it quickly. Discipline was maintained not with words, but with presence. A single glance from a respected captain could correct posture better than a whip. But as evening drew close, so did danger. Not always from enemies outside, but from within. Fires grew in hearths, and with them came the risk of spread. Drunkenness crept into halls, loosening tongues that should have remained silent. Secrets spilled. Gossip travelled. A careless insult could ignite a feud. A jealous glance could fracture loyalty. And in the tight quarters of a castle, silence was rare. Ears were everywhere. Trust was rationed. Even families navigated one another like diplomats walking through a minefield. And still, despite the weariness in every limb, people prepared again for night. Fires stoked, latches checked, animals fed and penned, candles trimmed, prayers whispered, charms hung above beds, the rituals repeated, not for belief alone, but for control. Because even in a stone fortress, vulnerability was constant. No one slept easy, no one assumed safety. Every creak in the floorboard, every flicker of shadow, every gust of wind became a messenger of either comfort or calamity. That sense of fragility was more than superstition. In a world with no smoke alarms, no secure locks, no understanding of infection or carbon monoxide, vulnerability was not imagined. It was encoded into the very architecture of life. The heavy stones of the castle, once viewed as invincible, became paradoxes. Their mass protected and imprisoned, their thickness muffled and distorted. And when disaster came, whether by fire, betrayal, illness or collapse, those walls would echo with it long after the screams had faded. Sometimes it started with nothing more than a cough. One servant sickened, then another, and within a week a full wing of the castle might be stricken with fever. There were no quarantines in the way we know them. The sick were moved to lower chambers, sometimes even the cold stone basements, with the belief that dampness could draw heat from the body. Herbal poultices were applied. Prayers whispered over boiling pots of rosemary and sage. Yet few recovered. Plague wasn't just a Black Death event. It was a recurring, creeping visitor in medieval life, and when it struck a castle, no title or wealth could seal its doors tight enough. Then there were the betrayals that came from within. Jealous rivals who whispered lies into the ears of lords, trusted stewards who siphoned off coin, chambermaids bribed to leave doors unlatched. Castles were microcosms of ambition, and ambition, when starved, turned poisonous. A sudden disappearance of a kitchen boy, a knight exiled for unspoken crimes, a lady's maid who vanished in the night, her name never again spoken. These weren't tales for entertainment. They were real, and everyone knew someone who knew someone who'd been silenced. The nights following such events were colder, heavier. Doors were double-latched. People slept in their clothes. Candles burned longer, at great expense, just to keep the dark at bay. Eyes darted at unfamiliar sounds. Conversations were brief, and in those moments the entire castle transformed. No longer a symbol of grandeur, it became a stone cage of whispers and survival. Yet life persisted. It always did. Even after the most unsettling night, morning came. Not in triumphant sunbursts, but in reluctant grey light through frost-glazed windows. Children stirred from piles of furs, noses pink with cold. Maids' stretched fingers still sore from scrubbing. Knights groaned as they swung heavy legs off creaking beds. Breakfast was muted. No one spoke of what they'd heard or feared, but everyone adjusted their routine. Subtle, instinctive, a knife placed closer to hand. A glance exchanged a beat too long. A prayer mumbled twice instead of once. Trust, in castles, was a currency more valuable than gold, and just as volatile. It could evaporate in a moment. One broken promise, one overheard accusation, and the invisible bonds of duty and loyalty began to fray. Lords understood this. They hosted feasts not only to celebrate, but to observe. Who sat where? Who laughed too hard? Who didn't drink? Who drank too much? These were signals. Maps of allegiance drawn in roast duck and goblets of wine. And what of the guards? Their ears heard what others missed. Their hands held the keys. Their shift rotations knew every movement inside the keep. Some remained loyal for decades, passed down their roles like heirlooms. Others sold knowledge, just a warning, just a hint to those who knew how to ask. Spies weren't always draped in black with daggers beneath their cloaks. Sometimes they wore aprons. Sometimes they brought the bread. Then came winter, when the castle turned from merely uncomfortable to nearly uninhabitable. Fires were stoked round the clock, yet still the breath of every sleeper fobbed the air like ghosts. Mice gnawed at stores. Ice formed inside jugs. Boots cracked from dampness. Horses in the stables wheezed and stamped, their bodies steaming in the chill. Wolves were heard more often now, closer. A howl in the forest, or worse, a silence where birds should be. Hunting became harder. Water froze. Bones ached more. And the long nights brought more than cold. They brought reckoning. With fewer distractions, less daylight, the mind turned inward. Confessions spilled in quiet chapels. Old grudges reawakened. A knight might remember a debt unpaid. A maid might recall a touch that lingered too long. People spoke less, but remembered more. Winter wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The castle's chapel saw more visitors now. Even the irreligious came. They didn't always pray. Sometimes they just sat, eyes half closed, letting the incense sting their nostrils and the chants quiet their thoughts. Because in that carved wooden room, with its flickering candles and worn stone floor, something like peace could be felt. And peace, in a medieval castle, was rarer than gold. But winter didn't last forever. And when spring thawed the ground, When the well water no longer stung the skin, people emerged from their routines like moles blinking at the sun. The smell of earth returned. Moss climbed higher. Birds nested again in the eaves, and the castle, for a while, breathed differently. Hope, tentative and fragile, threaded itself through halls still shadowed by memory. Yet no one forgot. Because castles didn't forget, every stone remembered. Every floorboard held the echo of those who had walked, crawled, or bled upon it. The fortress didn't care for names or stories. It simply absorbed them, layer by layer. And as spring turned to summer, and summer once again to chill, the cycle resumed. There were no clean slates in a castle. Only the next day, the next task, the next night of sleep that might be broken or blessed, and the next whisper that might change everything. Whispers were the bloodstream of a castle. They carried warnings, desires, revenge, longing, and sometimes salvation. But more often they carried rot. And just as rot could fester in wood long before it showed on the surface, so too did these quiet words poison lives before anyone realized the damage was done. In the great halls with towering ceilings and flickering torchlight, where lords declared justice and celebrated feast days, the real power often flowed beneath, in corridors, behind tapestries, through servant stairwells. Every whispered deal, every overheard confession was a thread, and those who knew how to weave them held a kind of invisible dominance. But what happened when those threads tangled, when stories didn't align, when suspicion spread faster than truth? Castles, for all their majesty, were incubators for paranoia. There were no lie detectors, no forensic tests. There was only testimony, often coerced, and judgment, often swift. A misplaced bracelet, a glance held too long, a servant caught in the wrong wing of the keep, these could spark accusations. A chambermaid accused of poisoning a goblet might be stripped, interrogated, and locked away before the cup was even tested. And many never made it to trial. Punishments were not simply about retribution, they were performances. A thief might be flogged in the courtyard, not because it would teach him anything, most would steal again, but to remind everyone else where mercy ended and authority began. The stocks, though crude, served the same theatrical purpose. Shame was as powerful as pain, and pain, in some cases, was deliberately public. A cook who served spoiled meat to the garrison might be made to eat it before the gathered crowd. A steward caught falsifying records might lose fingers, the very tools of his betrayal. And yet, these harsh measures didn't guarantee obedience. They bred cunning. People didn't become honest. They became careful. Secrets became currency. A stable boy who knew the knight's mistress was also a laundress could trade that knowledge for extra meat. A scribe who saw a lord's son gambling away the chapel's donations might find himself promoted quietly. It was a world where silence was power, and speaking could be both sword and noose. Then there were the guests. Castles were not hermit kingdoms. Nobles from other regions arrived regularly. Traders, emissaries, potential allies, or potential spies. Their presence changed everything. Servants had to be reassigned, rooms prepared, guards doubled, alliances had to be tested in real time, every meal a stage, every banquet a chessboard. And behind the glitter of diplomacy, the real negotiations happened in whispers over spilled wine, behind garden hedges, or through coded notes passed between bored ladies in waiting and curious squires. The language of courtly life was rarely direct. Insults were wrapped in compliments, affection disguised as political ambition. Even marriage proposals were games of strategy. A lady might be praised for her embroidery, when what was being noted was her fertility. A young knight's bravery in battle might be a way of saying he was too reckless to trust. To survive these social labyrinths, one needed more than etiquette. They needed intuition. And in castles, intuition was often the difference between rising and vanishing. All this unfolded while the castle itself remained outwardly unchanged. The stones stood, the banners fluttered, the bells rang. But within, dramas unfolded, quietly, brutally, relentlessly. A castle did not sleep simply because the sun set. Behind closed doors, lovers quarrelled. Scribes revised ledgers under flickering light. Captains whispered over maps. Nurses wiped sweat from a fevered brow, praying that the illness wouldn't spread, and someone, somewhere, always listened. There were, of course, those who tried to live simply within these walls. The kitchen girls who sang while kneading dough, the old gardener who spoke more to his herbs than to people, the boy who hid behind barrels just to escape the noise. Their simplicity was both armour and target. Because peace in a castle was suspicious, it meant you were either too naive to understand the danger or clever enough to appear unthreatening. And both were watched. Even love, if such a thing could bloom in those walls, was shadowed. There were no romantic escapes under moonlight. Meetings were stolen, brief, and dangerous. A lord's daughter caught with a squire could be banished to a convent. A servant girl pregnant with a noble's child might simply vanish. And yet they tried, letters hidden in loaf ends, tokens exchanged in chapel alcoves, songs whispered in stairwells. Not because they believed in happy endings, but because the act of loving, even fleetingly, reminded them they were human. Still, the weight of the castle crushed most of these moments. Time wore them down. Rules reasserted themselves. Weddings were arranged for alliances. Friendships faltered under suspicion. And all the while, new generations were born into the cycle. Children learned not only to walk, but to bow, to curtsy, to listen at doors and forget what they heard. They grew into the rhythm, inherited their parents' duties, their fears, their secrets. And so the castle endured. Not just in stone, but in habit, in echo, in the way silence clung to certain halls, in the way some doors were never locked and others always were, in the candle marks left on altar cloths, in the bloodstains hidden beneath replaced floorboards. It lived in the things unspoken, and in the people who learned to live without asking why. But some still asked, and those were the ones the castle noticed most, noticed and often punished. A question, even a quiet one, could be a chisel against centuries of order. Why does the steward's tally never match the store's? Why is the armoury door locked before dusk? Why is the kitchen maid always limping? The stones might not speak, but they heard. And when enough questions piled up, they didn't echo, they buried. Curiosity, in this world, was a candle in the wind. If protected, it illuminated corners long darkened. If exposed, it burned everything. A young monk might uncover discrepancies in the castle records and think he was doing God's work, only to be reassigned to a distant priory where letters went unanswered and winters were cruel. A guard who asked why patrols had changed might be sent to stand watch in the coldest tower night after night until his silence returned. And yet rebellion never truly vanished. It lived like mould in the mortar hidden, patient spreading. Not all revolts wore banners. Some came in the form of food salted too heavily, blankets given too thin, horses left unshod. A disgruntled servant might whisper to a rival noble's spy. A betrayed wife might leave one letter too many unburned. Small choices, quiet betrayals. But over time, enough of them could topple an entire lordship, because at the heart of every castle was a contradiction. It was built to be impregnable, yet it was sustained entirely by people. And people cracked, they aged, they envied, they remembered. No wall, however thick, could stop a rumour whispered nightly between beds. No portcullis could seal away a wronged cook with access to every meal. And while enemies outside might batter the gates with siege engines, it was the rot within that most often won. When castles did fall, it wasn't always with fire and fury. Sometimes they were surrendered, bloodlessly, by an heir who saw no worth in a crown. Sometimes they were sold to pay debts no war could settle. Other times they were simply abandoned, left to ivy and wind, their stories slowly crumbling with their stones. And as they faded into ruin, the villagers below barely noticed. Life had moved on, trade routes had shifted, wars had ended or begun anew elsewhere. But those who had lived within the pages, who had grown into knights, the maids who'd become widows, the squires who vanished into the woods, carried the castle within them. They remembered its smells, its silences, its unspoken rules. They passed them down, sometimes in bedtime stories, sometimes in warnings. Don't sleep near cold stone. Never leave a candle burning unattended. And always, always listen to the whispers. A ruined castle, even centuries later, retained its presence. Children dared each other to climb its walls. Scholars sketched its arches. Locals avoided it at night, claiming it groaned in storms. And sometimes, in the deepest winter, footprints appeared on its snow-covered steps with no trail leading in or out. The castle endured not just in history, but in fear. Because the truth was, no one really survived a medieval castle. Not completely. Some escaped, some aged out, some were forgotten, but no one left unchanged. Even the strongest minds found themselves haunted long after they'd left its walls, by a scream in the night, a door that never opened, a name once whispered that now caused shivers. They might laugh about it in taverns, dismiss it in daylight, but deep down they knew something of them had remained behind. That's what no book tells you, not the chronicles of knights or the ledgers of stewards. The real toll of castle life wasn't in coins or casualties, it was in the erosion of self, of how much a person had to sacrifice to stay useful, to stay safe, to simply stay. A castle could outlast a dynasty, but only because it consumed the people who sustained it, one by one, year by year, secret by secret. And so, if you ever find yourself gazing at its spires crumbling, its walls moss-covered, its silence vast, don't be fooled by the romantic haze of history. Don't imagine gallant feasts and noble quests. Remember the damp mattresses, the punishments whispered, not declared, the meals choked down with fear, the eyes that never truly closed at night. Because surviving even a single night in a medieval castle wasn't a matter of courage. It was a matter of surrender, of accepting that silence was survival, that questions were dangerous, that comfort was a lie dressed in fur and candlelight, and most of all, that once you entered, part of you would never really leave. And so, to sleep there, to truly sleep, deeply, safely, without dread, you'd need more than armor or favor or faith. You'd need to forget you were human. If your eyes are still open, you made it. Barely. Thanks for drifting through time with the Drowsy Historian. Subscribe for more dark, sleepless history, where the past never rests, and neither will you.